This video is regarding the claims made by the Nation of Islam, and in particular Wesley Muhammad. He wrote an article for The Final Call, which they published roughly a year ago, called, quote, Master W. Farad Muhammad and FBI CONTELPRO, unquote. The link is provided in the description box, and I suggest that everyone listening to this read that first, and then read my counter article, which I also provided in the link in the description box as well. And most importantly, read the FBI documents for yourself. Don't directly take either of our words. I posted the FBI's website in the description box too, and throughout the video I'll be referencing the FBI files. So if you're seriously interested in determining who's correct between Wes and I, open a separate browser and follow along and read the FBI files while you're listening to me. I'm going to be replying to a clip I found on YouTube from Wes's debate he had with Natural Tahudi, which was on in November 2009, and I'll easily refute his claims. The first thing is something that was in his article, which is incredibly dishonest, which I mentioned in my counter article, and this is blatant misrepresentation about the FBI files correlation summary, when it says that they were not able to, quote, definitely determine whether people mentioned in certain leads was Farad or Ford. This is from his article, and notice the ... Well, there's a dishonest reason why he inserted the dots and didn't quote the FBI file in that part. The ... would mention a paragraph which referred to a person whom the FBI file wasn't sure was Farad Muhammad. This was not saying that the FBI did not believe that Farad was Ford. They never indicated any such thing. In fact, the summary which he quotes says the exact opposite. Why didn't he quote those parts? I'll quote some of those parts later in this video. Here's just one example. Go to part 2 of the FBI files and go to page 49, which is page 9 of this correlation summary. It says that, quote, it is not definitely determined whether this individual was identical with the subject of the summary, end quote. Now, Wes would read that, and that only, and say, see, the FBI is admitting that Farad isn't Ford. But if you read the entire article and see who the, quote, this individual was in the paragraph, he's talking about a meeting that the FBI knew about on November the 5th, 1952, where one of the ministers asked people in the audience what Islam has done for them, and some elderly guy at the meeting stated that he had seen the light and, quote, dined with God, and said that, quote, Christ was born at 3408 Hastings Street in Detroit and was, quote, related to Mary. And due to this information, the FBI wasn't able to, quote, definitely determine whether the individual they were talking about was in fact Farad/Ford, the subject of the summary. Obviously, because of the conflicting information this elderly man was giving, which not even the Nation of Islam members believe. This is not saying that the FBI didn't believe Farad was Ford. So this is just one example of the disingenuousness of his article.
In 1956, the FBI discovered Wallace Don Ford in its quest to locate W.D. Farad. They did a year investigation on Wallace Don Ford. They interviewed Hazelbert. They sent agents to New Zealand and contacted his family.
This is wrong for two reasons. One, the correlation summary that he's referring to was compiled on February the 15th, 1958, which is 5.5 years before any FBI agents went to Wellington, New Zealand. Two, the FBI never claimed that they, quote, contacted his family, referring to Farad or Ford. Go to part 7, beginning at page 10 of the FBI files. The FBI claimed that they spoke with a man in Wellington, New Zealand, who knew of a Ford family that went to California, which was later determined by the Thomas police to be referring to a man named Walter, whose last name wasn't even Ford. I'll come back to this later.
At the end of their year-long investigation of Wallace Don Ford, they produced a correlation summary, summarizing 52-page correlation summary. They summarized their conclusion, and this is what they said. They said it was not definitely determined whether the individual referred to as W.D. Ford in paragraphs 2 and 5 above was identical with the subject of this summary.
See, this is why it's important to actually read the FBI files yourself, because once you do, you'll definitely determine that Wes either didn't read them himself, or he's depending on you not to read them. The portion that Wes quoted from is on page 37 of the correlation summary, which you could easily find yourself by going to part 2, then go to page 35 to 88. That's the correlation summary that he's talking about. Read the whole thing and you'll see that the FBI did definitely determine that Farad was Ford. At any rate, he's taking something totally out of context. He's talking about paragraph 2 and 5, where the FBI talks about how the assistant minister at the Baltimore mosque was talking about a Farad, and then in 5, there was a list of math problems where Farad was mentioned, and the FBI files said that the FBI couldn't, quote, definitely determine whether Farad mentioned in these paragraphs were the same Farad that the FBI clearly lists as an alias of Wallace Ford at the beginning of the summary, which should automatically eradicate any doubt that the FBI clearly believed that these two men were the same people, which they obviously were.
But he said the FBI concluded that Wallace Don Ford and W.D. Ford were the same. That's why he just spoke. He didn't have any documentation.
Okay, but I do have documentation. Just go to page 1 of the correlation summary report and see who the correlation summary is about. Wallace Don Ford. Now go to page 2. The aliases of Wallace Don Ford, according to the FBI, we have Wallace Farad, Wallace D. Farad, W.D. Farad Muhammad, and so on and so forth. Okay? These names are, quote, found as, in reference to Wallace Don Ford. Page 3 really kills Wesley's argument when it says right off the bat that, quote, this summary was prepared on the assumption that Wallace Don Ford was identical with the subject of FBI number 56062, which was Farad's FBI number. I mean, this is further evidenced by the fact that the FBI used Ford and Farad interchangeably. Why would they do that if they did not believe that Ford and Farad were the same person? Also, go to page 3. Also, stay on page 3. It says that, quote, the majority of the references found identical with Ford contained the name Allah, who was also identical with Ford. So the FBI clearly said that Ford was identical with whom the NOI followers called Allah, which you claim to be Farad Muhammad. You know, sorry, but you have to read these things.
They had determined that in 1957 they could not determine that they were the same one.
The FBI never said anything even remotely close to that. In fact, they said the exact opposite. They said that they did work under the assumption that they were the same person and that they were identical with each other. So what specific FBI document claims what he said? Well, it's not there. You can check all you want, but if you can, forward it to me. But it's not, does not exist.
But they got more firm on the non-identity in 1963. Because in 1962, the agents who they sent to New Zealand contacted Ford's relatives, a cousin, showed him a picture of W.D. Ford, and he said he is not him.
To read the memo for yourself so that you can clearly see how Wes is lying on this one, all you have to do is go to part 7 and begin at page 10. You could read it for yourself. The FBI went to New Zealand and interviewed the brother and sister of a man who the FBI thought was a man named Ford who went to California. Now, contrary to what Wesley claims, the FBI never claimed that they were interviewing the actual brother and sister of Wallace Ford, or Farad Muhammad. So Wesley is creating a straw man argument, one of the biggest logical fallacies you could make. The FBI spoke to these people in New Zealand and said that their brother, who Wesley Muhammad erroneously claimed was Wallace Ford, and said that their brother was born in October 1881, joined the American forces in 1914 until 1918. This guy returned to New Zealand in 1957 for 6 months, returned again for another 6 months, and is, quote, married and still at present residing at 1103 Pacific Avenue in Alameda, California. Now, obviously, this isn't the same Wallace Ford that the FBI has over 800 pages on in the FBI files. This is somebody else. This is totally all these things are totally inconsistent with the personage of Wallace Ford or Farad Muhammad. And if it really was Wallace Ford, which Wesley erroneously claims, all the FBI would have had to do is track him down, since he was supposedly still in California at the time anyway. So then the FBI showed the people who Wesley Muhammad claims was the brother of Wallace Ford, they show them a picture of Ford, okay, of Ford, and the brother and sister of who supposedly is Ford, but it really wasn't, and the brother and sister say that this is not their brother. To quote the FBI, they said that their brother, quote, is not identical with Ford, alias Farad. So, one, Wesley is lying, saying that the FBI interviewed the brother and sister of Wallace Ford. And 2, note that the FBI said, again, quote, Ford alias Farad, indicating that the FBI believed correctly that Ford and Farad were the same people.
Well, J. Edgar Hoover said fingerprint cards and identification division records at time of arrest, so his color was white and of Arabian descent, not New Zealand.
That point makes just 0 sense. It's a complete non sequitur. It's just, for that to make sense, you'd have to say that there were no Arabians in New Zealand. Just for an analogy, it'd be similar to a Mexican man being born in the United States, living in France, claiming that it was a, quote, contradiction that he was both an American who was of Mexican descent. It wasn't known with absolute certainty precisely what ethnicity Farad or Ford was.
File 253300971, August 12, 1974. The director says, as the Bureau is aware, efforts were made in 1963 to verify the birth and identity of Wallace Farad or Wallace Don. These attempts met with negative results.
This you could find on Part 7, page 74, the August 12th, 1974 memo. And now the first thing that should be noted is that the FBI is here again using Farad and Ford interchangeably, just as they have been the entire 800 pages of the FBI files. Second, the FBI has always maintained that they didn't know the exact date and place of Farad or Ford's birth because of all the conflicting information that Farad gave when he was arrested in California, Detroit, and Chicago.